Good morning, good day, greetings, salutations with a helping side. Welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Watty, and thank you for joining me today on our epic journey, adventure, or insert other adjective that goes with that. So, thank you for joining in. As always, thank you, producer Jeff, for joining us. And all those early birds who join in as soon as the stream goes live, I appreciate you and we appreciate you. I know producer Jeff likes to say hi, but he'll also say he'll appreciate you too. So today's episode is going to be a fun one. But if this is your first time here, let me take the second to pause and reintroduce myself. And myself is Tristan Watty. I come to you from the Professional Services Division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, form, and way. And usually I am joined by Russ. But Russ maybe might make an appearance, but I think we try to make this episode stand out because if you get the reference of today's title, 10 billion points to you. Right? Because it's a journey. And sometimes that journey you start out by yourself and then you get some fellow adventurers that might join you along the path. And see, producer Jeff does appreciate you. And I appreciate you if you chime in to say, where are you tuning in from? Where are you dialing in from? Where are you listening, watching, or anything else in between? Feel free to put that in chat. And as always, feel free to put anything in chat that you would like to ask because it's interactive and fun to do so. Just like our next question, which we always like to have two of, which I open it up to the audience. This question, would you rather have a fridge that restocks itself, but only with condiments, or a coffee maker that brews the perfect cup of coffee, but only between 3:17 and 3:19 a.m.? I know now that I'm reading this, I think I missed a joke of 3:16, but tune in, chat. What do you think? Hello, Ari. Thank you for doing that. And thank you. I appreciate those kind words. And if you had to pick one of these, which one would it be? It's interesting because I would go with the coffee maker that brews the perfect cup at 3:17. Here's my logic. Because if you were up at 3:17, you would need a perfect cup. 8 a.m., you take what you get. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you take what you get. 3:17, if you're up with a purpose, hopefully. So I would go with that. But feel free to disagree or comment otherwise. So the place I would like to go is exactly that. Do you disagree or do you agree? What do I mean? Well, let me take that step back and think about how I'm going to portray this. Today's episode title is based on 10 billion events, one detection. So how do you think about AWS when it comes to detection engineering, especially the fundamentals, right? It's all pieces of the puzzle that you try to inspire within your organization, especially when you're trying to build out that mysterious target state security plan, where you're trying to mature your organization to understand what the North Star is when it comes to your overall security posture. There's preventative, but there's proactive, but what is detection? And how do I engineer it out? Just how Ari engineers that going with condiments. I only need so much, and I can sell the oversight. That is a good point. Selling the overstock. I didn't think of it that way. That might be a business in itself. I was thinking about it. How often does your condiments go out? Right? That bottle of ketchup has been there from December and is going to be there for the following December. Right? But what should evolve and what should take on a different form every time comes to your detection mechanisms. And what I mean by that is, if you stick with me, last week we went over the topics of these are not the logs you're looking for. Centralized logging when it comes to AWS incident response. Now, we're taking it a step further to think about, hey, what happens when you have 10 billion events coming in and one detection mechanism? That's the place that we're kind of going. Because when you think about 10 billion events, can your organization scale to handle those items efficiently? in an optimal way, right? What is the detection formula that enterprises leverage on an ongoing basis to understand the events coming in, handle the events coming in, and then refine their mechanisms as these events happen within the organization? Because what you're trying to get to is exponential detection. And this is where you come from one account to building a civilization. And stick with me with this analogy, because the title is inspired by a particular, let's say, anime, where a scientist goes from rebuilding the foundations of humanity, right? One stone at a time. 10 billion points if you get that reference. And it all started with the basics, the fundamentals, in order to leverage things that were currently at his disposal that eventually helped to, let's say, stimulate different parts of, let's say, going from stone to signal, right? How do you go from building the fundamental building blocks of your security posture, your detection posture, that help to get you to a place where you understand and can be, let's say, resilient in such a way that you have all these events happening within your environment that, hey, I'm evolving from every time, but it's not impacting my organization. Essentially, how do you get to that 10 billion% detection coverage? We use that word because it's so exponential in nature. But the key part is, how do you start when it comes to detecting within your environment? How does a new detection rule get defined? Is it somewhat of a hypothesis that starts? Is that your first thought? Is like, okay, what if? Is that kind of how it is and you draw it out on the whiteboard? Or is it something where you're copying some type of rule from GitHub and then you tune it to refine into your environment's posture? Or is it, hey, my SIM vendor gives me this rules out of the box and I'm just going with that? Or is it more along the lines of, hey, I don't write detections, right? I have Amazon Guard Duty. That's my entire program. These are the things you start to think about, especially when you are, let's say, growing your overall response capabilities. So what you want to get to is an understanding of, hey, if I'm thinking about detection within my organization, I want to understand what all the key components are from start to finish. So when you think about the analogy of what is the formula, especially from, let's say, a threat modeling perspective, there's always usually a formula that comes of, hey, what is my risk versus a threat coming in and the mechanisms I have to put into place. These are key topics that are often brought up. But I think part of the conversation has to be centered around, hey, where do we go to next within our organization? So if we were thinking about this, and we'll put this poll over here if you want to put 1, 2, 3, or 4 inside of the chat. I think the conversation, if we were building upon this detection formula, is the structural detection idea using, let's say, an attacker performing said technique against said asset, which would generate this, which we can observe. Right? And if we were to think about this from our overarching analogy of coming to the place of, hey, how are we going from, let's say, the Stone Age to building signals and technologies? There's a lot that comes with this, because a detection without a hypothesis is just like dumping random chemicals together and hoping for a soda, right? You kind of have to know the formula for a soda. So the way to start building upon your organization in a certain way is helping to understand what the foundational pieces are that go into your formula. So if we were to take our threat hypothesis, we would start out by, okay, what is the adversary's objective? So What would an attacker try to accomplish? Is it persistence? Is it privilege escalation? Is it data theft, or whatever the case may be? Before you start to write your rule logic, then you start to define the expected telemetry signature. This is the specific API action, right? What is the network patterns or the resource changes that the attack would produce? Then you would start to go to, and I like your train of thought, Ari. It's your hypothesis of going forward. How can you document your assumptions and your blind spots and explicitly note what that hypothesis does not cover, so future detections can fill those gaps? Because it's just like we were saying, if we were to start from 0 to turn it into 1, we have to start somewhere. So if we are focused on identity, let's focus on identity. Because the joke in the threat modeling world is, okay, how can you prevent this person from rappelling into the data center and happen? We're not going that far deep. Let's start with the basic fundamentals of the challenges that you might think about. So if you're thinking about identity, think about it from the perspective of, if an attacker were to compromise IAM credentials, would call STS get caller identity followed by APIs like list users, is that the path you are going on? Is that the way you're thinking about it? And there's a lot of different, let's say, frameworks that you can take in order to understand these different pieces. But the main part that we're trying to get across is, when you get to the point of understanding a couple of different frameworks, you can start to think about the hypothesis that you kind of start with, right? One piece of that, if we go to like MITRE ATT&CK, for example. So if you think about MITRE ATT&CK, is that same thing that we were speaking about. It aligns the hypothesis to tactics, right? The initial access and credential access, so on and so forth. So if we want to think about, hey, how can I start building out my hypothesis? This is one of the ways that you can do so, right? So if we were to just go to attack.MITRE, there's a bunch of different ones. AWS has some published items that we will get to in the future. But one of the key things is, if you take a look at all of these potential items, the different techniques that are in here, right? They can barely fit on the screen right now. But essentially what we're trying to get to is the understanding that, hey, there's a lot of things that we have to consider and think about. So if we are looking at, okay, my environment has these different pieces of it, especially from just a security perspective, that I have to consider, right? Look at it from the reconnaissance area. So if we have reconnaissance, active scanning, gathering victim host information, gather victim identity, what pops into your head from your cloud perspective for each one of these pieces? These are the areas where you have to kind of really zoom in and kind of focus on, right? Because if you don't focus on the basics, now you start to get to an area that is, I'm trying to cover all these all at once and I have to figure out, and they kind of get jumbled together, and that's how your gaps start to form a little bit, right? So you want to figure out, hey, if you have all these different pieces, and these are, Harry, thank you for asking, these are potential vectors, right? Whether it comes from a reconnaissance phase, resource, initial access, these are the different techniques that someone can use in order to, hey, infiltrate or data exfiltrate or stay within your environment. So if you were to go into, right, let's say acquire access, it goes into the different techniques of what can potentially be leveraged, right? And these are all pieces of the puzzle that you have to account for within your environment. So if you go this way, right, it delves into these different techniques and different ways to help to mitigate it, right? So thank you for that question. So if you think of it that way, you really have to start with the ones and zeros, the basics of how do I go from that, think of that Stone Age, to relatively modern ways to deal with these items, right? Because the methodology, the format has changed, especially if you're migrating for the first time from on-premise infrastructure to a cloud infrastructure, such as AWS. Because now you have different areas to think about. Because you may have had it set up in such a way within your on-premise environment where everything has to go through the firewall, and this is how it proceeds within the environment. But if you have different accounts, if you have different VPCs, okay, is there VPC pairing? Do you have to share data between these different accounts? These are all pieces of the puzzle that you have to consider, especially from an identity perspective. We start there. But the real area that you have to start thinking about is, hey, which one of the logs, and this is kind of a hint towards last week, that I have active within my environment. And that's where the pieces of the puzzle come from, right? So if you have different logging sources, right? If you have CloudTrail, if you have VPC Flow Logs or Route 53 logs, yeah, it is interesting area when you think about, you know, all the different cases that you have to account for. It's fun, scary, fun, right? But it's interesting because now it starts to inspire you to think about, hey, I should have different hypotheses for these different areas of attack that I can fit into my detection formula. And part of the detection formula is going back to those log sources where you have CloudTrail logs or CloudTrail management events, let's say, which captures the control plane API actions. All right, the create user, the attach role, the put bucket policy, all those, right? The primary source for something like identity, if we stick with there. Then you have data events, which captures the data plane operations like the S3 get objects. VPC Flow Logs, think about the network layer. Think about the metadata that comes from that. And then resolver queries, which we spoke about, capture DNS lookups from the VPC. Those are all pieces of the puzzle. Go back to last week's episode to learn a little bit more about those and kind of centralized logging. But where we want to stay is the detection today, right? Because we have 10 billion events, let's say generating from one of those sources. Now, how do we get back to the place of enabling our infrastructure that leverages maybe some of the other AWS services? Think of the guard duties, think of security hub, detective, config, event bridge, where guard duty consuming some of those logs to say, hey, this is a threat. And I know this because I have ML and threat intelligence built into me. And I'm using this for the baseline coverage within my environment. Where one of our questions we posed earlier was, oh, I just rely on guard duty. Well, guard duty is one piece of the puzzle because there's other services that you could leverage. Just speaking from the AWS native service standpoint, right? You have Security Hub, where you have the aggregation and normalization layer that consolidates the findings from guard duty and Inspector and Macy and other third-party tools. But another piece of the puzzle, you have Amazon Detective. You may say, okay, that fits, right? It gives me that graph-based integration tool to visualize the relationships and everything. But you also have config rules, and then you have Event Bridge, right? Where resource configuration changes and event routing. Now you start to think about, these are a lot of pieces of the puzzle. And if I'm getting 10 billion alerts or events in, how do I deal with this in one detection rule? And the piece of that, of getting to that one detection, is in that formula. Because can you write rules, especially from an event bridge standpoint, that comes to, hey, if it matches this pattern, I want to specifically call out, hey, this is matching. Now I have to account for this. And you can use certain things to reduce the noise. Event name, user identity, source IP address, error code, so on and so forth. But you can also use negative conditions to exclude expected behavior, because that's usually when you get into the tuning, some of the things that from an engineering fundamental standpoint that you have to do. Because excluding automation roles, CI/CD pipeline IPs or AWS service principles from the alerts, you have other mechanisms to detect that, right? You can have other ways to kind of validate that. But these are known things that you set up. What you are trying to get to is an understanding of, hey, for the last 90 days, I queried my CloudTrail logs, and now, hey, I can test some of these rules against my hypothesis rules that say, hey, this is a common thing that I'm noticing. Now I can test it via historical data using Athena, before deploying it into production, let's say, right? And this helps you to measure kind of the volume that goes into this. So you're leveraging the tools that you have, right, to take you out of a place of so much overwhelming items to very specific pieces of the puzzle. And that's what we're trying to get to here, right? Because an example could be, all right, I'm building an end-to-end detection for STS, right? Yeah, say a STS assume role, right? And making sure that that is not getting used inappropriately, especially that and get session token, right? Which could lead to credential exfiltration, right? Your hypothesis that you're building out is attackers, let's say, stole long-term access keys, which call SES get session token to generate short-term credentials that can bypass, let's say, something like MFA, something we don't want. And then in your hypothesis, you're like, okay, if this happens, what is the data source? Well, what is the data source that we would get this from? Well, CloudTrail management events, because it has to do all these actions in order to recognize something, right? You have your API being management calls, the actions that are taken in your environment, and that's listed within your CloudTrail logs. Okay, now can I craft an event bridge pattern that can say, hey, create a rule that matches if something like this happens, then authenticated MFA session token, that gets flagged, especially if it's from a human. And then the second half of that is you can build a trigger, let's say via Lambda and Event Bridge, that targets and revokes that active session, right? Disable the access keys and just notify your SOC or other personnel via Slack or PagerDuty or something you have in place. But it all started with that hypothesis is, what if long-term access keys were generated? Which I hope you don't have long-term access keys, right? Because this is what can occur, is you have long-term access keys. Now you can start to manipulate the environment in certain ways of like, okay, I have long-term access. Let me take away from this and grant something else that you might not be looking for unless you have started to build out your detection and the engineering functions that come from your detection capabilities, right? That's how you start with the fundamentals and eventually get to a point where exponentially you can deal with all these detections, because we were just talking about one instance. It's just identity. If you go back to our thought process of, okay, now that we have all these different types of vectors, now you can multiply this and you can see how easily we could get to 10 billion events happening and occurring that you have to account for. But threat not. This is where we start to get to some of my puns, right? I do less puns when Russ isn't here. I got to start doing more puns, right? Threat not. So the way you kind of move forward from an exponential is thinking of it this way. If we are starting with this one account and we want to turn into, let's say, a civilization of different accounts, multi-accounts, now we have to start to think about, what is our delegated administrator architecture? I take that dramatic pause for a reason, because when you think of delegated admin, there's certain services that should pop into your head, especially from just a delegation standpoint. Because what you want to do is get to a point where, hey, if I have something like, I don't know, let's say guard duty within our environment, I have a way to handle multiple accounts in guard duty, right? I don't know if you want the puns to keep coming, Harry. I can say it all day. But I was just about to say when I had to restrict myself. But when you start to think about guard duty, Think about delegated administrators. Also, same with Security Hub and config and so on and so forth. You want to get to the place where you have an idea that, hey, all these things from a multi-account perspective, I know how to deal with, right? Especially when you're dealing with multiple accounts. I keep calling this out for the specific reason of if you have an AWS organization that you are taking care of, that you are managing, guard duty should be one of the mechanisms on your list. Because the ROI on guard duty, right, is great. Because it is low cost compared to everything that it helps you to gain visibility into. Like I was saying, the CloudTrail logs, the management logs, all those things that we were speaking about, right? Now it can help feed your automation. It can feed your visibility, your dashboards, so on and so forth, right? And you can have a delegated administrator, like we were saying, as more accounts get spun up, guard duty automatically gets put in. And it has the centralized findings aggregation, and you can configure with Security Hub, all great stuff. But the key aspect of this is, even if you have third-party tools, right, and partner services, they also gain visibility by leveraging guard duty, right? It's not something that, conflicts as much as it's additive. So if I were to compare this, it's like getting hot cocoa and adding marshmallows over it, right? That's kind of, it just enhances that overall taste, that flavor, right? That is missing. Do you have the coffee? I mean the cocoa? Yeah. But do you have the custom threat intelligence that you're able to modify within your environment? Because if you look at it really, we zoom in, enhance. I got to work on my voice for that. But essentially what we want to get to is this piece here, right? So if you look at the different mechanisms that you have in place, where you have EKS protection, S3 protection, runtime monitoring, malware protection, EC2. Now, list goes on and on. And for each of these, especially when it comes to AI workloads, now you start to figure out, hey, what are some of the foundation, the building blocks? Now that we're adding more into our puzzle, right? Because we were talking about how do we add some more visibility, understand the guardrails, understand the automations that we can put into place with something like guard duty, especially from a custom threat intelligence. So if we have something, hey, somebody remove something from a bedrock guardrail, we're going to find out. Change the source data for a model, we know, right? These are the different pieces of the puzzle that we're trying to get to, because as we get to understanding these pieces, a key thing and line that I like to point out is the fundamental guard duty threat detection monitors AWS CloudTrail management. This is an important concept because when you're thinking of your overall hypothesis on how to get to a certain point of understanding, part of it is understanding which service you use when. We always, put it up. It's like, hey, certificate knowledge is important, right? We put on the screen 2 or 3 times because I like for the people on the other side of the internet to see it. But also, these are all the fundamental pieces of, hey, before you go down a certain route, you should learn which each service or what each service does and to what extent and how they interplay into each other. Because when you're engineering your detection mechanisms, the fundamental item is, hey, how do all these services work together? And how can I optimize my environment with the initial tools that I gathered? And that's how you become a little bit more mature within your overall security posture. And then you start to pick up, hey, maybe I can start to add certain things to pipelines, the CI/CD within my organization. Hey, making sure that if I'm using Terraform, if I'm using CDK constructs, if I'm using CloudFormation, or just parameter management, I have these different pieces in place so that I get to a point that, hey, I have somewhat of understanding how things work within my environment, but to what extent I have the coverage. Because we're not thinking of trying to solve for all the the different pieces of the puzzle. I'm trying to figure out what this little corner does, right? You have 3 pieces in the corner. You're like, okay, this kind of fits. And I can put it together a certain way. And eventually, it starts to build out the picture of your environment. But sometimes it takes, some help to take that step back and see how other environments are structured. And that's where we go and kick off our favorite part of the show, which is, let's go on a side quest. Figure out, because side quest legend has it, is our segment where we delve into a customer story. And that customer story is based on a little bit of different experiences that we have had and that we like to share. And the way we convey that is through our physical side quest board. So in order to go on said side quest, let us tell the tale of Vault Harbor Energy. Right? That sounds like a fictitious name if I haven't heard one. But Vault Harbor, they thought, hey, we need resilience. We need operational technology security. Why? Because they're the leading operator of smart grid orchestration and distributed energy. Okay, that means that they cannot be down. So now that they migrated their telemetry pipeline and their AI-driven load forecasting engine, they say, hey, we need to implement some additional centralized logging. And if we look at our centralized logging and our starting places, as we always have, we have our unauthenticated users, our authenticated users, our centralized storage, and our AWS environment as a whole. Okay, great. Now, if we think about it from this perspective, we have an organization that has growing capabilities. They have a need for energy. They have to keep the lights on. That pun was for Ari. So as we start to think about it, thank you, Vault Harbor, right? It comes up. But let's say they have 2.3 million distributed energy points. They have to follow certain rules. They have certain rules like ISO and so on and so forth, right? But the thing that they have to get to is an understanding of, hey, something happened within the environment. There was a gap that was exploited. And their threat intelligence flagged one of the API service accounts as authenticating from infrastructure, let's say, linked to a known threat actor. And that account has read access to, let's say, a good amount of their environment, to their specific industry proprietary items. So how do we get to a point of solving this? This is the piece of the puzzle that we need to figure out. Because if we had mechanisms in place, we could help to detect. The logs were immutable, but the detections were absent. So some of those detections needed to be called out. So how do we call out those detections? Well, we start at the fundamentals. We start at, hey, what were the CloudTrail logs? If somebody unauthenticated was accessing these logs, what did we have to do to figure out something was occurring within the environment? And feel free to put in comments in the chat if you have any comments. But I think part of the mechanism is, if we're going off of today's episode of engineering detection mechanisms, because even if you just have CloudTrail turned on, especially if you have an AWS organization, you have the CloudTrail within the regions that you're operating, good thing. So now you can start to think about, okay, this is one piece of the puzzle. Now we have to zoom out. We have to add additional mechanisms in place, because what we're trying to get to is a piece of our environment that is currently missing. Let's put our missing piece there. There's nothing it goes to. What is ingesting into? And that's where we have guard duty. Right? We have guard duty with an environment that is coming and looking at the CloudTrail logs and say, hey, something is happening. There was identity pieces detected within the environment. Now we have to search, and we can do searches via like a Athena query and going through and some investigations. But the other pieces that we can put into play to help us understand our environment a little bit better, something like Amazon Detective, where you can gain some additional insights into your environment, especially if you had somebody unauthorized or identity that says, hey, this is unauthenticated. Something's going on, right? So now you can start to piece together the different aspects of what's happening within your environment. Now the CISO is looking at it, it's like, all right, now we have some type of detection. We have these mechanisms in place that we can start to understand and take everything step by step. And by step, I literally mean step by step with a step function, right? Because we have something happening and we can set up different mechanisms and automation orchestration within the environment so that if something occurs, then we can detect and react. And that reaction is depending on the organizational structure. So you can have something where automation kicks off that, as we spoke about, maybe if you have long-term AWS keys, those keys are revoked and that account triggers some type of alert to your PagerDuty, something along those lines to stop said attack from happening. And these are things that you can build out, especially if you're trying to protect said AWS environment. And these are just a few of the mechanisms that you can implement. But the key pieces of the puzzle is something like GuardDuty and CloudTrail, and having maybe one or two items to build out the rest and the remaining parts of your overall security posture. But this tail seems short, but it can, let's say, take a little bit of a turn. What turn is that? Well, that's where we hit the pause game, the Zach Morris timeout, as I call it, and kind of zoom out of the entire thing. Because what we're trying to get to is an understanding of, hey, we have our AWS environment, but do we have different mechanisms to elevate our overall detection pieces within the environment? Do we have maybe a hypothesis-driven detection program where every detection starts with a document threat hypothesis using something like MITRE, let's use that as an example, that eventually gets back to a detection as code pipeline, kind of a theory, right? A detection theory, where you have, let's say, a get-backed peer-reviewed CI/CD deployed across your environment where, hey, these different rules that happen within the environment, you can, let's say, implement in such a way that it reacts specifically to how your organization is set up, right? So what I mean by that is if you have one incident responder, now you can, let's say, elevate the capabilities of that one incident responder, right? So we have a question. Ari, is a step function like a Lambda? That is a good question to ask. Step function, serverless compute that executes a single short-running, let's say, event-driven process, opposed to, let's say, step function, which has multi-steps that it can take, right? So if something happens, it's more of a workflow with multiple steps that can be taken. So thank you for that. So if we're thinking about it from that perspective, you have a Lambda that triggers, it could be a single event to say, hey, isolate this or do this or take this action. And you can have multiple Lambdas, but you can also have a multi-step function to add some additional logic in that is more complex depending on your use case, which goes back to, hey, how do I have and take 10 billion events into one detection? if you do something like a multi-step function, now the logic can help triage some of these different pieces of the puzzle for you. Because if you see A, B, and C happen within your environment, now you can take a series of steps in order to help. All right. And I say, hello, Chuck. And thank you again for that question, Mary. Because when you start to go from the Stone Age to Signal and more advanced, you're starting to figure out ways to, how do I activate all of these logs in such a way that it helps visibility? It's not a strain. It's more of enhancement to my environment. Because you have a centralized logging architecture, right? And you have and design an immutable source of truth with your dedicated log archive account, your S3 object locks, all those things that we discussed before. But now, how do we convert those raw logs for efficient analysis? So if we were to take the side tangent there is, hey, if you have something like a Parquet conversion with glue, now you can transform the CloudTrail JSON into, let's say, column-based Parquet format, which helps to, one, optimize things and also helps with Athena as well when you're trying to search and query, because you want to get to, let's say, ad hoc piece of the puzzle. And what I mean ad hoc is if you have an incident responder responding to something, they have to take a snapshot in time. You want to be able to quickly and efficiently query these pieces. Man, Stone Axle. I get that reference. Thank you for that. No handle. So other pieces and ways to do this, if you use OCSF, right, and its schema and using something like Security Lake or something along those lines, right, where you're taking all these log sources and then handling it in a certain way that you can have and grant subscriber-based access to your different downstream tools. Think of the Splunks, the Snowflakes, custom analytics, all those kind of things, right? But the idea is the same, is you're taking your source and leveraging it a certain way so that you can optimize your overall detection and automation workflow. Because what you want to look at is, what is my real-time versus my retrospective detection? How do I balance streaming and historical for analysis? This is something I've spoken with a bunch of customers, a multitude, right, of customers, a myriad. I'm looking for a couple of different ways to say 3 different ways. So when you have streaming detections, right, the seconds, the minutes, those count. You can have some event bridge rules, the CloudTrail API, calls, triggers immediately, response for high severity threats. But you can also have near real time, where you start to get down to minutes and hours, let's say. And that's where you can take something like a Kinesis data fire hose with a Lambda transformation to enrich and have these detections for context lookups. This is where your incident responder comes in. Or maybe you have the retrospective hunting, where you start to get to the point of, hey, this is more hours of days, or hours to days, I should say, where you start to say, hey, we're trying to retrospectively look back and see, piece together the different pieces of the puzzle, right? And that's where you start to get into the Athena queries against something like a Security Lake, right? And exactly that, right? It's the trade-off, is what are you looking towards, right? How are you getting to that place of understanding, especially when you're trying to tier this detection strategy, right? We're engineering the fundamentals of our basis. We need to understand what streaming detections, what near real time, and then what retrospective pieces that we have. And often what we see customers do is, hey, we just send everything to the SIM. And if you send everything to the SIM, you're going to get everything in the SIM, right? What is the prioritization that you have? What is the optimization you can take before it gets to the SIM? Do you need to send everything right away, or do you have a different tiered mechanism in order to say, hey, how do we enrich some of the data and try to, let's say, add context at the ingestion time, right? Maybe we add some GeoIP enrichment. Maybe we add some IAM principal tagging or asset inventory context, so that we help to reduce some of that noise that we were speaking about and also optimize what goes into your SIM. Because if you have everything just go over there without it being optimized, now you have to set up different rules and different mechanisms and things of that nature within the SIM piece, where you can help along the way cut down and reduce the pipeline size a little bit, right? So if you have something like end-to-end STS abuse where you have that workflow in place, something triggers, event bridge pattern gets picked up, that get session token that we were speaking about. Now, what happens if we have an enrichment step where we have something like a Lambda function that queries the GeoIP, the IAM tags, and let's say recent activity baseline, right? To score the event in a certain way. So that, hey, the high score, always video game analogies, right? So high score event happens that creates a finding in Security Hub, which gives full context to something that happens. And you can also have it triggered to your SIM as well, but you're adding, the whole point is the enrichment step. So the final piece of that would be the automated response, which can trigger your SOAR workflow to revoke sessions and so on and so forth. But you're essentially getting to a point where you're making these little modifications that help you to reduce and kind of enrich what's happening within your environment. Now you can take different mechanisms and give different tools to your incident responders. And I think that's kind of where we're going with it, is like, how can I empower my incident responders and just overall infrastructure architects, my engineering resources, to build the environment a certain way from a detection standpoint that is based on that hypothesis that we keep speaking about, that develops over time and that's scalable. Because if I were to ask the question to chat, hey chat, which API call worries you the most from an SES perspective? Is it assume role where you have unexpected principles? Is it guest session token without MFA? Is it assumer role with identity? Is it get federation tokens? Which one is it? These are certain things you have to start to think about, right? Because depending on how you react to these, could point out, hey, what do I have set up in my environment? Hopefully you can react to all of these, but if you're missing out on these different pieces of the puzzle, then it's something you can start to think about with your different incident responders of like, hey, have we seen this? Or have we set up something for this, right? Because all these are parts of your incident response strategy. And there's a certain thing that we always say at the end that it's also a part of. So feel free to say, hey, which one worries you the most, right? And there comes out, assume role from unknown principle equals panic. I love that saying, right? It just equals panic. It's like, who did this? What did this, right? That's where you kind of take that step back and you sip your beverage of choice and you say, we got to figure this out. And that's usually the piece of the puzzle, right? So feel free to continue to put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat to say, hey, which one of these worries you the most? I'm curious. But this is how we are starting to head towards, how do we get to 10 billion% detection coverage, right? That I even wrote it out. How do I get to this? 10 billion%. If you could read backwards, 10 billion points to you. But I couldn't write backwards. The controls on the data pieces that we were speaking about, essentially what we're trying to get to is, how do I figure out all those detection mechanisms that we spoke about, all those techniques that we can potentially get, exposed to. This one right here, this whole list of things. How do we get a little bit better about setting up our hypothesis one piece at a time? How do we understand the mappings? I think it boils down to one, hypothesis, but also how do we track within our environment from a performance standpoint? And you may say, hey, What do you mean? How do we track? Well, what is your true positive rate? What is your false positive rate? What is your mean time to detect and mean time to resolve? These 4 things are all pieces of the puzzle. How do you answer that? Because the true positive rate is the percentage of the alerts that represent the actual malicious. It's not, hey, something happened within the environment because I enabled this. No, what was the actual true positive rate versus the false positive rate of, hey, this is just a known alert that keeps occurring. And we know about it, right? But how long did it take us to detect it? How long did it take us to respond to it? And what is the alert to incident ratio within our environment? And that ratio is the total alerts to confirmed incidents within your environment. And this helps to measure the detection, precision, and analyst workload, right? There's some great articles and great features on that within AWS. It's just talking about, hey, how much workload does your analyst have? And part of that is understanding all these different metrics. So as you get down to understanding, that's one piece of the puzzle. The other piece is, how do you have a detection of code pipeline? Dramatic pause. This means, how do you have production rule, I would say production grade rules within your deployment, right? And those production grade rules is, you have linting and syntax validation. Well, validate your YAML, validate your event bridge. You have unit testing, you have integration testing, you have progressive rollout, and change auditing. All these things that are needed, especially when you're thinking about your pipeline. But the one piece, peer reviews, governance workflows. Those are also pieces of those puzzle. But your detection as code is the linting pieces, the unit tests, so on and so forth, because you want to get to a point where all that stuff is automated so that you have a peer review process that's relatively functional. And I use the word functional for a specific reason. It's because the peer review process should be that second set of eyes after all these other checks have been done, right? You're not relying on one individual to catch everything that's happening within your environment. Because you know what happens? They don't catch everything in your environment. I will date myself by saying, if you remember that I Love Lucy episode with the chocolate conveyor belt, that's how it is. Sometimes with peer review, it's like, hey, we need to push something out. Can you review this? And you take a look, and it's miles and miles of code that keeps coming, right? And what eventually happens is one gets by. And what you're trying to do, essentially, with all these detection engineering fundamentals that we're speaking about, is reducing that amount that is coming down that conveyor belt so that you can focus on, hey, is this optimized? Is this the best pattern? Is this leading to the best outcomes from our incident responders, from our reporting, from our dashboards, to affect and analyze everything that's coming down the way? And the best way to figure this out, piece by piece, bit by bit, is to understand, hey, do we have the right fundamental certificate knowledge in place? But also, did we go on enough knowledge quests? And knowledge quests, if this is your first time joining, is essentially those pieces of documentation you grab after your 5 a.m. run, the beverage of your choice. You sit down and you say, hey, what's happening in AWS world? What's happening? What should I know? And how do I do it? So if I'm thinking about going from the stone world, the stone age, to modern, especially from a security standpoint, how do I get to a point that I know that I'm starting out at level 100, starting out as a beginner, and eventually move my way from a village apprentice? That's the way you can look at it, right? If we're going back to the stone age of thinking, right, of just taking it step by step. That's what we mean by that. All right, what are the fundamentals we need to know? Well, I think I pointed at one of them. And one of those key pieces of fundamentals is, what is something like guard duty? What does it do within my environment? We went over it. But there's some key concepts and terms. And I keep stressing guard duty because it's one of the factors that you want to have. And most customers that we see within, let's say, having a mature security posture, they have guard duty somewhere baked in within their environment, right? Doing something, and it's targeted. And then eventually you get to a point where you say, hey, I have Security Hub. CSPM, that's another part of it, right? Cloud security posture management. So that if you have different events happening within your environment, and we're going through this kind of fast because this is how sometimes it feels like. And we really want you to take the dive into it because we want to get, from being too fast, from looking at all these services, to be a little bit, more contained. But if you want to go from that L100 to, let's say, 200, what is the next step? Well, one, we spoke about from the hypothesis standpoint and just figure out different frameworks you go from a, let's say, threat modeling standpoint. But figuring out what are some of the other services that you can use, like Detective, where you're taking a magnifying glass, then automatically builds behavior graphs and so on and so forth of your environment. But how do you build secure from the start? Knowing these different pieces is how you go from L100 to 200. This is how you become a science engineer, right? Hypothesis, scientific method, always great things to test out within the testing environment. That's why you have the experimental OU within your AWS organization, hopefully. That eventually goes to a sandbox, that eventually goes into development, and so on and so forth. Have the different levels. Because the different ways I like to consider this is you're starting out your environment relatively new to AWS sometimes, or relatively new to understand the concepts. So the way you go from 1 to 2 is understanding, hey, I know all the different pieces of the puzzle. Now I can start to put them together in such a way that, hey, I can create, let's say, event bridge patterns. What is an event bridge pattern? Well, hey, we are starting to send the context to help build out those flows that we were speaking about till we get to a point that it's not so foreign to us. We understand what a threat detection entity list is. We understand how to customize it further and analyze log data with CloudWatch. These are all pieces of the puzzle that we're kind of going fast through because 10 billion%, there's a lot of things to go through, especially if you want to become a 10 billion% tier detection architect. But it all starts at taking each piece of the puzzle one part at a time, one service at a time, till you get to the part of understanding that, hey, we're not looking at the holistic environment right now. We're looking at piece by piece, then eventually taking that step back to understand what my hypothesis went to. And the funny thing about a hypothesis is there's also omni hypothesis. And one of those is a collection of all of your different hypotheses. And I know there's the multi-way to say it, but I didn't have enough coffee to say it in that particular way. So we'll leave it until next week when Russ comes back to see if he says it. But the thing I will leave you with is keep building up your experience points. 1 XP point at a time, 1 blog at a time, or just 1 story at a time to listen to, so that you eventually build out your detection engineering muscle so that you could turn 10 billion events into 1 detection. And how do you do so? Well, you help to build an incident response plan. That's kind of one piece of it. The other piece is tune back next week and every other week to find out a little bit more. So until next time, thank you. Have a good day. Happy Monday. Take care.